The ground was already fighting back. Ruth Holt drove the shovel into the Kansas soil and felt the resistance all the way up through her wrists, her elbows, her shoulders, into the place between her shoulder blades that had been aching since September. October had come early this year, and the frost had moved in behind it like an uninvited guest who intended to stay. Each strike of the blade produced a sound she had never heard soil make before, a dull, reluctant clang, like metal meeting something that had already decided it would not cooperate. She dug anyway. The grave needed to be 4 feet deep. That was what you did. That was what the ground required and what Harold deserved and what Ruth Holt was going to provide whether her hands cooperated or not. She was 63 years old. Her knuckles had been swollen since August. The cold made them worse. She noted this the way she noted most things, as information, not complaint, and continued digging. The October sky above the Kansas plain was the color of old pewter flat and indifferent, pressing down on the yellow grass in the half-finished sod house and the small chicken coop, and everything else that constituted the sum of a life she and Harold had been building for 3 years. 40 acres, that was what they had come for. 40 acres of their own, purchased with the savings of 20 years of careful living in Ohio, a retirement that looked nothing like what other people called retirement, but felt to them like the beginning of the real thing. Harold had wanted land, not a garden, not a yard, land. The kind that went all the way to the horizon and belonged to you completely, the kind that answered to no landlord and no employer and no man with a ledger. They had talked about it for decades through the years, when the children they never had would have been born, through the winters when money was thin, and the idea of Kansas was the only thing that kept the cold from feeling permanent. Harold had researched it the way he researched everything, thoroughly, quietly, alone with his books and his notes in his careful handwriting that looked like it belonged in a document someone intended to keep. They had arrived in the spring of 1883. Ruth had been 60 years old. Harold had been 62. Their neighbors in Ohio had thought they were insane. Their pastor had prayed for them with the particular fervor reserved for people who are about to do something irreversible. Their doctor had suggested gently that perhaps the frontier was better suited to younger constitutions. Harold had shaken every one of their hands and thanked them for their concern. Ruth had already packed. The first 2 years had been hard in the way that any beginning is hard, full of problems that were simply the price of starting problems that did not feel personal because they afflicted everyone equally. The sod house took 6 months to build properly. The first winter tested everything they thought they knew about cold. The soil was more demanding than the pamphlets had suggested, resistant to the plow in ways that required patience Harold had and stubbornness Ruth had in greater quantity. But they had worked. Harold with the fields, Ruth with the chickens and the kitchen garden, and the careful management of what they had. They were not wealthy people and had no expectation of becoming wealthy people. What they wanted was sufficiency enough to sustain themselves, enough to stay enough to prove that 60 years of living had taught them something the young had not yet learned. The chickens were Ruth's domain entirely. She had brought 18 hens from Ohio, transported in wooden crates on the back of the wagon, noisy and indignant for the entire journey. She had hand-selected each one, choosing for temperament as much as productivity, because she had learned over decades that a flock that wasn't anxious was a flock that laid consistently. By the summer of 1886, her hens were producing 8 to 10 eggs per day. She sold the surplus in town for 15 cents a dozen, money that went into the jar beneath the floorboards that Harold called their spring fund and Ruth called their margin. The margin was what stood between them and asking for help. Ruth Holt had not asked for help since 1871 and did not intend to begin now. Harold had gotten sick in late September. The fever came the way typhoid always came, without announcement, without the courtesy of a warning. He was tired one evening in a way that seemed like ordinary tiredness, the kind that comes from harvest work and shortened days and the particular heaviness of a body that has been working hard since spring. Ruth had noticed but not alarmed herself. Harold was 65. Tiredness was appropriate. By the third day, she knew it was not tiredness. She did everything she knew how to do, which was considerable. She had nursed Harold through a bout of pneumonia in 1872, and through a broken collarbone in 1879, and through the grief that followed the loss of their third child before it took its first breath. She knew his body the way you know a house you have lived in for 40 years, every sound it made, every way it settled, every sign that something was wrong with the foundation. The signs were all wrong now. She kept the fire high. She changed the cloths on his forehead every 30 minutes through the night. She got water into him when she could held his head, when she couldn't sat beside him in the chair that had been Harold's chair for 3 years, and told him things she had never quite managed to say out loud in 4 decades of marriage. Not dramatic things, ordinary things. The particular way morning light came through the south window. The sound the chickens made when they were content. The way the Kansas sky in August looked like nothing she had ever seen anywhere else. She told him she was glad they had come. He died on the 9th night quietly while she was dozing in the chair. She woke to a silence in the room that was different from ordinary silence, a silence that had weight and shape, and a finality she recognized immediately, the way you recognize the end of something even before your mind has caught up with what your body already knows. She sat with him until morning. Then she went outside, found the shovel, and began to dig. The digging took most of the day. The frost was already in the top 3 inches of the soil, and she had to use the iron bar to break through it before the spade could find purchase. She worked steadily and without stopping, because stopping felt like the beginning of something she could not afford to begin. When the grave was done, she went inside, washed her hands and face, changed her dress, and sat with Harold for another hour before she went to find the Walcotts 2 miles east to tell them what had happened. The neighbors came for the funeral the following afternoon, such as it was. Lavinia Pruitt drove in from the north side of the creek, 77 years old, and moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned that haste costs more than it saves. She had buried a husband of her own 12 years ago, and she understood the particular arithmetic of grief, that it could not be rushed, could not be reasoned with, had to be simply endured the way you endure weather by staying inside and waiting. She stood beside the grave and said nothing, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done. The Walcott family came from 2 miles east, the Hendersons from town Old Reverend Marsh, who read the service with the unhurried gravity of a man who has done this many times and understands that the words matter less than the weight behind them. And Dorothea Crane, who ran the general store with her husband Emmett, came last, arriving in a wagon that was too large for the occasion, in the way that Dorothea herself was somehow always too large for the room she was in. She was a broad-shouldered woman in her late 50s, with a face that had been pretty once and had settled into something more severe, the kind of face that forms when a person has spent decades being right about things and has stopped being gracious about it. Ruth read from Harold's Bible, the one he had brought from Pennsylvania before he came to Ohio, the one with his mother's name in the front and 40 years of his own margin notes in handwriting that had grown smaller and more careful as he aged. She read the 23rd Psalm because Harold had loved it and because the words were the right shape for what the day required. The neighbors left in the order they had come. Lavinia Pruitt was the second to last. She stood beside her wagon for a moment, looking at Ruth with eyes that had seen enough of the world to know what they were looking at: a woman standing alone at a fresh grave with dirt still on her hands and 40 acres of frost-hardened prairie in every direction. She did not say anything encouraging. She did not say anything at all about how things would work out or how Harold was in a better place or how Ruth was stronger than she knew. She had lived too long for those sentences. She reached out and briefly pressed Ruth's hand with her own. Then she climbed into her wagon and drove north. Dorothea Crane was the last to leave. She stood beside her wagon for longer than the occasion required, looking at the half-finished sod house, at the small chicken coop on the eastern side of the property, at the fresh grave with its simple wooden marker, and at the woman standing beside it. There was something in her expression that might have been concern and might have been calculation, and in Dorothea Crane those two things were often difficult to distinguish. "Mrs. Holt," she said finally, "you should think seriously about what comes next." Ruth said nothing. This was a technique she had developed over 6 decades of dealing with people who had more opinions than she had asked for. "A woman alone out here at your age." Dorothea shook her head with the particular motion of someone who has already reached a conclusion and is performing the reasoning for your benefit. "The winters are not like Ohio winters. You understand that, I think, but perhaps you don't understand what that means practically. For a woman alone." "I've survived 2 Kansas winters," Ruth said, "with Harold." Dorothea let that settle for a moment, let it do its work. Harold did the heavy work. Harold knew the land. A woman of 63 alone with no family within 500 miles. She paused. I say this as someone who wants to see you well. Ruth had known women like Dorothea Crane her entire life. Women who delivered bad news with the particular satisfaction of people who believe that the truth as they see it is a gift regardless of how it lands. Women who confused prediction with concern and whose interest in your welfare was inseparable from their interest in being right about your welfare. I'll be fine, Ruth said. Your chickens will stop laying when the cold comes. Dorothea said it carefully, like she was explaining something to a child who was slow to understand the lesson. November at the latest, usually sooner. When the days get short, the hens stop. By December, you'll have nothing from them, and by January, they'll be dying. That's not a prediction, that's simply what happens. Ruth knew this. It was one of the things she had been turning over in her mind since the morning Harold died, a cold and specific worry that lived beneath the larger grief like a stone beneath shallow water. The eggs were her income, 15 cents a dozen, 8 eggs a day, 3.5 dozen a week. It was not a fortune, but it was money coming in. Money that supplemented the provisions Harold had laid in and kept the jar under the floorboards growing rather than shrinking. Without it, the arithmetic changed entirely. Without eggs, you have no income. Dorothea continued with the momentum of someone who has prepared this speech and intends to deliver it in full. Without income, you cannot buy what you need to see the spring. And without spring, she stopped. She had made her point. She was too experienced to overstate it. I appreciate your concern, Ruth said. I wonder if you do. Dorothea looked at her steadily. Emmett and I could help find a buyer for the claim, someone who could work the land properly. You could have money for a room in town, a position perhaps at the boarding house. Dignified work, safe work, work suited to a woman of your years and situation. She paused, then added with the particular gentleness of someone delivering a sentence they believed to be mercy, let someone younger have the land, Mrs. Holt. There's no shame in being practical. Ruth looked at her. She thought about 40 years of conversations with Harold about these 40 acres. She thought about the wagon ride from Ohio 3 years ago with Harold reading landmarks from a folded piece of paper and pointing things out like a man on the best day of his life. She thought about the first morning they had woken up on land that was theirs completely and legally and permanently theirs, and the way Harold had stood outside in the early light, just breathing the air with his eyes closed, like a man saying a prayer that did not require words. She thought about the grave she had just finished digging, about the 4 feet of frozen Kansas soil she had moved by herself with her swollen hands because that was what was required, and she was the one here to do it. Thank you for coming, Mrs. Crane, she said. The roads will be freezing by evening. You should start back before the light goes. Something moved across Dorothea's face, a quick, complex passage of emotion that Ruth didn't try to identify. It might have been offense. It might have been reluctant respect. It might have been the particular displeasure of a woman who is accustomed to having the last word and has just been denied it. It was gone before Ruth could be sure of what she had seen. I'll tell Emmett to watch for news from you, Dorothea said, whatever you decide. She climbed into the wagon, took up the reins, and drove away toward town without looking back. Ruth stood in the October wind and watched her go, the wagon growing smaller against the flat immensity of the prairie, the wheels raising thin lines of dust that the wind took immediately, as though the ground itself was erasing the evidence of her visit. Then Ruth went inside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at Harold's chair, at the depression in the seat cushion that 40 years of Harold had left behind. She looked at the Bible on the table, still open to the 23rd Psalm. She looked at her hands, still carrying traces of the grave, despite the washing. Then she sat down, found a piece of paper and a pencil, and began to write numbers. The provisions were in the root cellar. Harold had dug in August 7 crates of dried goods, 4 sacks of cornmeal, preserved vegetables from the kitchen garden, salt pork in a barrel, enough flour to see her through March, if she was careful, through April, if she was very careful, through May, if something she hadn't anticipated went wrong, and she needed the margin that careful people always build into their calculations. Harold had planned for a hard winter. He had planned for harder winters than they had yet seen, because Harold planned for the worst and hoped for better, and it was one of the things Ruth had loved most about him. She counted everything. Then she counted it again. Then she sat at the kitchen table with the piece of paper and wrote down numbers in 2 columns, what she had and what she would need. 6 months of provisions if she was disciplined. More if she was strategic. The chickens were producing 8 eggs a day right now. At 15 cents a dozen, that was roughly 10 cents a day. Not a great sum, but enough to supplement what she had, enough to buy the small necessities she would need through the winter, enough to begin accumulating towards spring seed by February if she managed it with the attention it deserved. But Dorothea was right about one thing: the eggs would not last. Ruth had watched it happen every year since she had been keeping chickens, the gradual slowdown, as the days shortened, the hens growing quieter and less active, the nesting boxes producing less and less until by December, there might be 1 or 2 eggs some days and none on others. It was not illness. It was not mismanagement. It was simply the way chickens work their bodies governed by light in a way that no amount of feed or warmth or careful tending could override. They were ancient creatures operating on ancient instructions, and the instructions said, when the days grow short, stop. By January, she would have no egg income. By February, she would be drawing down reserves with nothing coming in. By March, she stopped writing. She sat for a moment with the pencil in her hand and looked at the numbers on the paper. Then she looked at Harold's chair across the table, the empty chair with the slight depression in the seat cushion that 40 years of Harold had left behind. The chair looked the way a lot of things look now, structurally present, functionally absent. "I need to think," she said to the empty chair. It was not the first time she had spoken to it today. She suspected it would not be the last. She did not cry. She had not cried since the morning Harold died, when she had sat with him until the light came and allowed herself 15 minutes of grief, and then stood up because there were things that needed doing, and grief, however legitimate, did not do them. This was not coldness. This was not the absence of feeling. This was the mechanism by which Ruth Holt had survived everything that had happened to her in 63 years of living, and she trusted it the way she trusted her own hands, not blindly but practically, based on evidence accumulated over a long time. You find the problem. You look at it directly without flinching and without embellishing. You figure out what can be done and you do it, and you leave the rest alone. The problem was the eggs. She spent the rest of that day and the next day and the day after that thinking about the eggs. On the 10th morning after Harold's funeral, Ruth went out to the coop before breakfast, as she always did. The air was sharper than it had been the day before, and the grass crackled under her boots with the stiff brittleness that came when the overnight temperature had dropped below 20. She could see her breath. The chickens could see theirs. She lifted the latch on the coop door and went to the nesting boxes. First box, 1 egg, cold from the night, not yet warmed by the morning. Second box, empty. Third box, empty. Fourth box, 1 egg, slightly smaller than the first, laid sometime in the early hours when the cold had been at its worst. 2 eggs. Yesterday there had been 7. Ruth stood in the coop doorway with 2 eggs in her palm and felt the specific quiet weight of Dorothea Crane being right. Not about the land, not about Ruth's character or her capabilities or her prospects for survival. About this one thing, the one variable she had built her entire remaining plan around. The eggs were going. Dorothea had said November at the latest, and it was not yet November, and already the count had fallen by more than half in a single night. She stood there for a long time, long enough for the cold to work its way through her coat and settle into her shoulders. Then she went inside, placed the 2 eggs on the counter, sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the wall. She stayed there for an hour. Then she picked up the pencil and began again to think. Lavinia Pruitt came back on the 4th day after the funeral. She drove in from the north in a cart pulled by a mule that moved with the philosophical slowness of an animal that has long since made its peace with the pace of the world and sees no reason to renegotiate. Ruth heard the wheels on the frozen ground and came out to find the old woman climbing down from the cart with the careful, negotiated movements of someone whose joints have developed opinions about how quickly things should happen. Lavinia was 77 years old. She had come to Kansas from Pennsylvania in 1849, had survived 3 husbands in 2 droughts and 1 winter so severe that half the county's livestock died before February. She was not a woman who drove 4 miles in October cold to make conversation. When Lavinia Pruitt made the trip, she had a reason, and the reason was always the point and never anything else. Ruth waited at the fence. Lavinia tied the mule to the fence post, looked at the chicken coop for a moment with an expression Ruth couldn't quite read, then looked at the ground around the coop and then looked at something in the middle distance, that Ruth couldn't locate, some interior calculation being worked out behind careful eyes. My mother-in-law kept chickens in Pennsylvania, she said without preamble, without the social scaffolding that most people constructed around useful information. Underground, in a cellar dug beneath the barn floor, every winter while everyone else's hens sat in frozen coops and did nothing but eat, feed, and shiver, hers laid through to March. Ruth was very still. The ground stays the same temperature. Lavinia continued in the same even tone, as though she were reporting weather observations rather than delivering something that might change the direction of a life. Doesn't matter what happens above it. 8 feet down the earth holds at 50, maybe 55 degrees. Doesn't freeze in January. Doesn't bake in July. Just stays. The same every month, every year. She paused. The hens think it's still fall. Their bodies don't know to stop. The silence after she finished speaking was the kind of silence that follows something important. Not empty, but full, the air, holding the words a moment longer than usual. Did your mother-in-law build such a thing here? Ruth asked. She died in Pennsylvania, never came west. I only heard about it from my late husband, who told it as a story about his mother's cleverness, and I never had enough hens to make it worth trying myself. Lavinia looked at Ruth with the direct steadiness of a woman who has always understood that information is most valuable when it is delivered cleanly without conditions attached. But I thought you should know the idea exists. She said nothing more about it. She came inside and drank a cup of coffee and talked about the weather coming down from the north and the condition of the road by the creek and the Walcott family's decision to bring their cattle in early this year, which was either good judgment or excessive caution, depending on how the winter went. She stayed 40 minutes and then left, climbing back into her cart with the same deliberate care with which she had descended from it. Ruth stood in the doorway and watched the cart until it disappeared over the rise to the north. Then she went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and picked up a piece of paper. She did not know how to build an underground chicken coop. She had never built one. She had never seen one. She had only the idea of it, a cellar underground warm enough that the hens couldn't tell the difference between November and September, warm enough that their bodies kept on doing what bodies do in fall rather than what they do in winter. She understood intuitively from decades of working with the physical world that the idea and the execution were entirely different orders of problem, and that the gap between knowing something was possible and knowing how to make it actual was where most good ideas went to die. She began to draw. The first sketch was wrong in ways she could see immediately. The drainage was wrong, which meant the chamber would flood in the spring thaw. The entrance was wrong, which meant cold air would pour directly in every time she opened the door. The depth was wrong, which meant that she would still be above the frost line and the temperature stability Lavinia had described would never materialize. She crossed it out without ceremony and started again on the back of the same paper. The second sketch was better, but raised a question she hadn't considered. How would she reinforce the walls without proper lumber? The third sketch answered that question, but created a new one about the roof. She couldn't span 10 feet with the scrap wood she had, not safely, not with the weight of Kansas soil pressing down from above. The fourth sketch solved the roof problem, but made her think about something she had not thought about at all yet, a question that sat at the edge of her mind, insisting on attention. How would the hens get light? She put the pencil down. She sat with this question for the better part of an evening, because it was the kind of question that felt like it had an answer but would not give it up without real thinking. Light was not something she had put in her original conception of the space. She had been thinking about warmth, about temperature, about the simple arithmetic of feet below the surface, multiplied by degrees of stability. But a chamber 8 feet underground in November would have no natural light at all, and she was not sure now that she turned her attention to it, that warmth alone would be enough. She thought about her hens, about the fall slowdown, about the way it always tracked with the shortening of the days rather than the dropping of the temperature. The two things happened together, which was why she had always assumed they were the same cause. But sitting here now in the lamplight, thinking carefully about what she actually observed each autumn, she began to wonder. She thought about where her hens preferred to be in the coop. The ones that laid most reliably all through October were the ones that roosted nearest the south-facing window, the ones that got the most light for the most hours of the day. The ones that dropped off first in November were always in the back corners, the shadowed places. Temperature. Light. Which one? She did not have the answer yet. But she had the question, which was the first step, and she had the fifth sketch taking shape on a new piece of paper. And by the time she went to bed, she had something that began to resemble a plan. Not a finished plan, not a plan she was prepared to stake her winter on, but a beginning. She looked at her hands before she blew out the lamp, swollen at the knuckles. The skin cracked at the base of the right thumb where the cold had got into it. 63 years old and not what they had been at 30 or 40 or even 50. Still capable of holding a shovel. She put on her coat the next morning, went outside and walked the property until she found the south-facing slope of the small rise on the eastern side of the 40 acres, a gentle hill, 8 feet at its highest point, with a natural grade that would carry water away from any hole she dug rather than into it. The prevailing wind came from the northwest, and the hill would stand between the chamber entrance and the worst of it. The aspect faced south, which meant the low winter sun would have the best possible angle for whatever light solution she devised. She stood on the south face of the rise for several minutes, looking at the ground the way Harold had taught her to look at it, not just seeing the surface, but reading what the surface indicated about what lay below. The grass here was a particular shade of tawny brown that spoke of soil that drained well and compacted firmly. No standing water in the low spots. No heave from the freeze-thaw cycle in the places where moisture trapped itself. Good ground, stable ground, ground that would hold. She went to the barn, found the long-handled spade and the short-handled one, and the iron bars she used for breaking through the hardpan that appeared in the fields every few feet, carried them to the base of the rise, and drove the long spade into the earth with the full weight of her body behind it. The ground resisted. The frost was only in the first few inches, but the prairie roots made the topsoil dense and interlocked, resistant to intrusion, in the way that established things resist change. She drove the spade in again. The sound it made was not quite a clang and not quite a ring, something between the two, a sound that carried across the flat land and was absorbed by the enormous indifferent skiing. The frost was only in the top few inches. Below that, the earth was cold but workable. Below that, she would find the stable temperature that Lavinia had described, the ancient steadiness of the ground below the frost line, the part of the earth that the surface weather could not reach. She worked until the light failed. Then she went inside, ate dinner, standing at the stove, because sitting down felt like a decision she might not easily reverse. Sat for a moment in Harold's chair because she needed to, and went to bed. Tomorrow she would dig more. The day after that she would dig more still. She did not know exactly what she was building yet. She knew only that she was building it, that the clay beneath the Kansas topsoil was solid and stable and would hold what she asked of it, and that somewhere between now and the first real snow, she was going to solve the problem of the eggs. That was enough to start with. It had always been enough. Outside, the temperature dropped through the night toward 10 degrees. The frost crept deeper into the soil. The chickens huddled in their above-ground coop heads, tucked under wings, doing the patient ancient work of keeping themselves alive through the dark hours. 2 eggs today. Ruth noted it before she slept, the number written at the bottom of the 5th sketch. She looked at it for a moment, then turned the paper over. Tomorrow she would start making sure that number changed. The digging took 3 weeks. Ruth had known it would be hard. She had dug wells in Ohio, helped Harold with the root cellar, turned soil that didn't want to be turned, and broken ground that had never been broken. She knew what hard felt like, and she had never been frightened of it. She had not known it would be this particular kind of hard, the kind that lives not in any single moment of effort, but in the accumulation of moments, the kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but simply builds day after day in the shoulders and the lower back and the place where the palms meet the shovel handle. The kind that greets you before you're fully awake and is still present when you're trying to sleep, a low, constant physical argument that the body makes with what the mind has decided to do. She began before first light each morning. The darkness in October came early and stayed late, and she used the last of it to eat, to dress, to drink coffee, standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the rise she had chosen, its silhouette barely visible against the slightly lighter darkness of the pre-dawn sky. By the time the sky went from black to the particular gray-blue that preceded actual dawn on the Kansas plain, a light that was less about illumination than about the gradual withdrawal of darkness, she was already at the base of the hill with the long spade in her hands. She had marked the entrance on the south-facing side exactly where she had decided it would go low enough that the slope of the hill would protect it from the north wind that came down in January, like something with a personal grievance, high enough above the grade that water would drain away from the opening rather than into it. She had staked the corners of what would become the chamber with iron rods driven into the ground, measuring carefully, checking the angles twice with the plumb line, because Harold had taught her that a mistake in the measuring stage costs 10 times more to correct than a mistake made anywhere else. The first 3 days were the hardest. The topsoil here was dense with the root systems of decades of prairie grass, a network of fibers that went down 2 feet in places, woven together so tightly that the spade bounced off them rather than cutting through. Ruth used the iron bar to break the surface open, then the short-handled spade to clear the loosened earth, then the long-handled spade to go deeper. It was 3 tools and 3 separate motions for every cubic foot of progress, and progress in those first days was measured in inches rather than feet. By the end of the first day, she had gone down 18 inches over a space roughly 4 feet square. Her hands were bleeding where the blisters had formed and broken and formed again in the same places, the new skin not yet toughened enough for this work. She went inside, cleaned her hands in cold water, wrapped them in strips of linen she had cut from an old shirt of Harold's, ate dinner, standing at the stove, and went to bed. She slept without dreaming, which was its own kind of mercy. The second day she went 2 feet deeper in the same space, the root zone giving way to the first layer of solid clay. The third day she understood something important about the Kansas subsoil, that below the root zone and the first dense clay layer there was a stratum of packed earth that was harder than what came above, but fractured in larger, cleaner pieces when you found the right place for the iron bar. It required patience rather than force. The material had its own logic, its own structure of weakness and strength. And if you imposed your will on it directly, it resisted. If you read it carefully and worked along its natural lines, it cooperated. Harold had said something like this once about a different problem, entirely about a difference of opinion, with a neighbor that had been resolved eventually by patience rather than confrontation. You don't fight the material, he had said, talking about the neighbor, but meaning something broader. You find where it wants to give, and you ask it to give there. Ruth found where the Kansas subsoil wanted to give. She asked it to give there. By the end of the first week, she was 4 feet down in a space 6 feet square. Not deep enough yet, and not wide enough yet for what she intended, but deep enough to feel the change that Lavinia had described. The air at the bottom of the excavation was noticeably different from the air at the surface. Stiller, denser. The particular quality of air that has been in contact with deep earth for a long time and has taken on its temperature and its weight. It was not warm exactly, but it was nowhere near freezing, and the contrast with the air above, which was now staying below 20 degrees through most of the day, was sharp enough to feel immediately. She ran her hand along the eastern wall of the excavation. The clay was cold to the touch, but not frozen. Solid. Stable. She could feel through the clay the enormous thermal mass of the earth around it, the accumulated warmth of everything below the surface that the surface weather had not been able to reach. She noted this the way she noted things that confirmed a hypothesis with satisfaction, and then continued working. Emmett Crane came by on the 9th day. He came alone without Dorothea, which told Ruth something about the nature of the visit. Emmett was a quiet man, not the quietness of shyness or discomfort, but the deliberate quietness of someone who has concluded that listening provides better information than speaking and has reorganized his habits accordingly. He was in his early 60s, broad through the chest from decades of loading and unloading freight at the general store, with hands that looked as though they had been made for physical work and had been doing it long enough to stop showing the cost. He pulled his horse up at the fence line and looked at the excavation for a long time without saying anything. Ruth kept digging. She had learned over 6 decades that silence rarely needed to be filled and that filling it preemptively was usually a mistake. "What are you building?" he asked finally, in the tone of a man who has already formed a hypothesis but wants confirmation before proceeding. "A cellar," Ruth said. Then, after a moment in which she considered whether more explanation was warranted, "for the chickens." A silence. Emmett looked at the hole, at the substantial pile of displaced earth to the north of it, at the iron bar leaning against the slope. "Underground coop," he said. Not a question, the tone of a man processing information and converting it into a category. "The ground holds temperature below the frost line," Ruth said, stopping her work for the first time since he had arrived. 50 degrees or near it regardless of what the surface does. Warm enough for the hens to keep producing. Emmett looked at her with the expression of a man running careful calculations. He was not a man who dismissed things quickly. He had spent enough years in commerce to know that the gap between what seemed implausible and what actually worked was narrower than most people assumed. "You dug this yourself," he said. "No one else offered." He was quiet again for a moment. Then he got down from his horse with the unhurried movements of a big man who is deliberate about everything, walked to the edge of the excavation and looked down at what she had achieved. "You'll need to go another 4 feet at least," he said. "Maybe 5 to be completely safe of the deep freeze. And the chamber needs to be wider than this for 18 birds to move freely." "I know," Ruth said. "I'm getting there." He nodded slowly. Something in his face shifted not dramatically but perceptibly, the way a man's face changes when he has updated his assessment of a situation, and the new assessment is different from what he brought with him. He did not offer to help. She did not ask him to. They both understood something about the particular dignity of a thing done by the person who had decided to do it, and that understanding passed between them in the silence without requiring articulation. "Dorothea thinks you'll be gone by Christmas," he said. He said it without inflection, as a piece of information, not as an opinion. Ruth drove the iron bar into the clay at the bottom of the excavation and leaned on it. "Dorothea is welcome to her opinion," she said. Something moved at the corner of Emmett Crane's mouth, a brief controlled expression that arrived and departed quickly, like a thought he had decided not to say out loud. He tipped his hat, climbed back onto his horse, and rode back toward town at the same unhurried pace at which he had arrived. Ruth watched him go for a moment, then went back to work. She dug faster that afternoon. Not from agitation, but from something closer to its opposite, a steady, focused energy that came from having her purpose confirmed by someone else's attention, from knowing that the thing she was building was visible and being assessed and found by at least one person who understood practical things to be worth assessing. The second week of digging brought her to 7 feet in the main chamber, which was now 8 feet square, and beginning to have the quality of a room rather than a hole, a sense of contained space of walls and ceiling and floor, defining a place that had not existed before. The walls were solid, packed clay, dark and dense, self-supporting, in the way that good prairie subsoil supports itself when it has been undisturbed for long enough. The floor was level. She had checked it with the plumb line on a string, the same method her father had used for every horizontal surface he built. On the 12th day, she decided to run a test. She had been thinking about the light question since the evening she first raised it to herself, and she had not yet arrived at a satisfying answer. The test would tell her what she needed to know, or at least narrow down what she needed to figure out. She caught 3 of her hens chosen for temperament birds she knew were calm enough to be handled without injury to either party birds that trusted her handling because she had handled them consistently and carefully for years. She carried them down into the chamber in a wooden crate, filled a water dish from the barrel, scattered a handful of grain on the bare earth floor, and left them there. The chamber was dark, not dim dark. The entrance was sealed with the canvas flap she had hung as a temporary door, and no light penetrated from above. The temperature read 52 degrees on the thermometer she had mounted on a nail in the east wall. She went back up, sealed the entrance, and waited. The next morning she went down before dawn. She stood in the darkness for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to a blackness that did not adjust. There was simply nothing to see. The 3 hens were moving around somewhere in the chamber. She could hear them, their small sounds, their feet in the straw she had scattered on the floor. She felt her way to the eastern wall and found the first nesting area she had made from a wooden crate laid on its side. Empty. She found the second one. Empty. The ground directly behind the crate. Nothing. She stood in the dark chamber and thought about this. The temperature was right. The hens were healthy. She could tell from their sounds, the active quality of their movement, that they were not distressed. They had water. They had feed. They were warm, or at least not cold. By every measure she could think of, the conditions for laying had been met. And yet, she stood very still in the dark and let her mind work through what she knew about her hens. She thought about the fall slowdown, the way it tracked so precisely with the shortening of the days. She thought about October's last reliable layers, always the birds that roosted near the south-facing window, always the ones with the most daily light exposure. She thought about the previous November, about watching one hen continue laying 3 weeks past the point where the others had stopped, and how that hen had always found the one angle in the old coop where the afternoon light lasted longest. She stood in the dark chamber and felt the idea arrive. Not temperature, light. The chickens stopped laying, not because they were cold, but because the days got short. Their bodies did not count degrees, they counted hours. The trigger was photo period, the length of the day, and when the light fell below whatever threshold their ancient biology had established, production shut down the way a mill shuts down when the water level drops below the wheel. The chamber was dark, not cool dark, completely totally without any light at all. She had solved the temperature problem entirely and had not touched the real problem at all. Ruth climbed out of the hole, emerged into the pale November morning, and stood on top of the rise in the cold wind, looking at the sky. The sun was already angled so far south that it barely cleared the horizon at noon, running its shallow arc across the bottom quarter of the sky. Short days, getting shorter. Every day between now and December 21st, a little shorter still. She needed light inside the chamber. She needed to give the hens what the shortening days were taking away, enough light to convince their bodies that the season was still productive, that the biological instructions that said stop had not yet been triggered. She needed to fool something that was older than memory, older than domestication, older than the entire accumulated history of human farming, into believing it was still September. The question was how. She thought about it for the rest of that day, and through most of the night lying in the dark of the sawing house, with the wind working against the walls and the fire ticking down in the stove. Oil lamps were an option, but oil cost money she didn't have in significant quantities, and flames underground with 18 chickens and 6 inches of straw on the floor was a combination she did not like the arithmetic of. Glass. She sat up in the dark at something past 4 in the morning, with the thought fully formed and clear, the way solutions sometimes arrived after a night of working on them below consciousness. Glass did not have to be new. There was an abandoned claim 2 miles to the west. A family named Alderton had taken the land 3 years ago in the same wave of homesteaders that had brought her and Harold to Kansas, and had given up after one winter left in April of 1884 with whatever they could fit in their wagon and the rest standing. She had passed the site a dozen times. The sod house was still there, partially collapsed now, 2 winters having worked at the sod bricks with the patience that weather brings to everything. But the west wall had been standing the last time she passed, and the west wall had a window. She dressed in the dark, drank cold coffee standing at the stove, and went outside to look at the sky. Clear. Cold somewhere near 10 degrees, she judged by the feel of the air on her face. The stars were the particular bright and numerous stars of a dry, cold night, so sharp and close they seemed almost architectural. She read the sky the way she had been reading it for 60 years, still dry. No weather moving yet. She would go at first light. The walk took 40 minutes, moving steadily across frozen ground that was solid enough to bear her weight without the treacherous soft spots that appeared in the thaw. The air had no moisture in it, the kind of cold that was clean and complete, that made everything look harder edged than it actually was. The Alderton house was worse than she remembered. The south wall had surrendered entirely, the sod bricks losing their cohesion through 2 cycles of freezing and thawing, until the wall had simply subsided and the roof had followed part of it down. But the west wall was standing, and in the west wall, exactly where she remembered it, there was a window. The glass was cracked, a diagonal fracture running from the upper left corner to somewhere near the lower right, probably from the first winter when the frame had shifted and the glass hadn't moved with it. But the crack was tight. The 2 pieces were held together by the pressure of the frame and by the ice that had worked its way into the fracture and frozen there, binding the break as effectively as any adhesive. The glass was whole in the sense that mattered. It would admit light. Ruth stood in the collapsed interior of the Alderton house and looked at the window for a moment. Then she took off her coat. She wrapped the glass in her coat with the careful, firm attention of someone who understands exactly what they cannot afford to lose. She tucked the bundle against her chest, crossed her arms around it, and walked 2 miles back across the Kansas plain in nothing but her wool dress and her work boots in the cold. She was extremely cold by the time she got home. She did not fully register this until she set the glass carefully on the kitchen table, and her hands began to shake, not from exertion, but from the cold that had accumulated in the walk back, the cold that her coat had been preventing and was now free to express. She stood very close to the stove until the shaking stopped, then drank hot coffee, then stood at the kitchen table and looked at the glass she had carried back. 18 inches wide, 24 inches tall, cracked but intact. It was enough. She spent the rest of that morning solving the second problem, where to put it and at what angle to maximize the light it would deliver to the floor of the chamber below. The sun in November in Kansas ran a shallow arc across the southern sky, not overhead the way it was in June, but close to the horizon, low and angled, offering light at an oblique angle that favored surfaces tilted toward it. To capture the maximum amount of that light through a hole in the chamber ceiling, the hole needed to be positioned and angled to intercept the sun at the period of its peak intensity, which in November meant the hours around midday when the sun was at its highest point in its low arc. Ruth spent most of that morning with a stake driven into the ground and a length of string tied to it, watching where the shadow fell and tracking how it moved as the hours passed. This was not sophisticated astronomy. It was the same practical observation that people had been making for as long as there had been people who needed to understand where the light went and why, watching, noting, adjusting, concluding. By noon, she knew where the skylight needed to go. She cut the hole from inside the chamber, working up through the 18 inches of compacted earth and root fiber and matted grass that formed the ceiling, feeling her way carefully with the short-handled spade and the iron bar. When the blade broke through into open air, she felt the cold and the light arrive simultaneously, a thin, pale column of November sunlight falling down through the earth to the floor of the chamber, weak by any outdoor standard but real and actual in that dark space. Daylight where no daylight had ever been. She widened the hole methodically, keeping the dimensions close to the size of the glass. Then she climbed out, cut a wooden frame from the scrap lumber she had been accumulating since the house was built, fitted it into the hole with the precision of someone who had thought about this moment for several days and knew exactly what was required, and set the cracked glass into the frame. She packed the frame tight with strips of rags soaked in rendered fat, a sealing method she had seen Harold use on the root cellar gaps, simple and effective. It would keep out most of the wind and most of the cold and admit most of the light. She angled the frame 11 degrees south of vertical. She had worked this out over 2 evenings at the kitchen table, using the geometry she half remembered from a schoolbook she had read in 1832, the same geometry she had used when calculating the angle of the root cellar drainage, checking her figures 3 times because she did not have the luxury of spare glass or spare time. Then she stood back on the top of the rise and looked at what she had made. From above, it was nearly invisible, a slightly raised wooden rectangle in the grass, catching the low winter light at an angle that made it look from any distance like nothing more than a patch of frost. From below inside the chamber, the column of light it admitted reached all the way to the straw floor and spread there into an oval shape, roughly 2 feet across, pale and steady, not the dramatic illumination of summer, but light, real light, the signal that ancient bodies needed. Ruth descended the ramp and sat on the chamber floor in that oval of light. It was enough. She was certain of it now in a way she had not been certain of anything since October. The temperature was right 52 degrees and stable as Lavinia had said it would be. The light was right enough to signal the hens that the day was of a productive length. The space was the right size for 18 birds to move and scratch and roost and lay without crowding. What she needed now was the floor. She carried the straw from the barn in 2 trips, large unwieldy armfuls that shed in every direction in the morning wind. She packed it 6 inches deep across the entire floor of the chamber, tamping it and then fluffing it back up, distributing it evenly with attention to the corners where hens preferred to settle. She built roost perches from the birch branches Harold had cut and stored in October for the various small construction needs that accumulated on a working farm, 3 perches at varying heights, the lowest close enough to the floor that an older hen could step up without difficulty. She built 4 nesting boxes from scrap pine, each just large enough for one hen to sit comfortably open at the front, and lined with fresh straw mounted on the east wall, at a height that felt right in the way that things feel right when you have been paying close attention to what chickens prefer for a very long time. The vestibule she constructed last a small anteroom at the entrance, just large enough to turn around in with a proper wooden door on the outer frame and a heavy canvas flap as the inner door. The double-door arrangement was the same principle as the ice houses she had known in Ohio, a dead airspace between the two doors that prevented the temperature of the main chamber from equalizing with the temperature outside every time someone went in or out. She moved the chickens underground on the 1st of November. It was a Tuesday. The morning had the particular character of mornings before major weather, unnaturally still, the air holding itself with a suspended quality, the sky gone from gray to a flat, pressurized white that experienced eyes recognized as the ceiling of a system arriving from the northwest. The hens did not cooperate. Ruth had expected this. Chickens are creatures of habit in the deepest sense, not merely habitual in their behaviors, but habitual in their understanding of the world structured by pattern in ways that made sudden disruption genuinely distressing to them. She had replaced their entire world at once, the familiar coop with its familiar smells and familiar light and familiar ground, replaced by a strange ramp descending into darkness and earth and strangeness. They squawked. They backtracked. They stood at the top of the ramp and looked down it with the particular sideways head posture that meant a chicken was making a decision and finding the decision difficult. Ruth coaxed them with feeds scattered along the ramp, a trail of grain leading downward, an old and reliable appeal to the pragmatism that lay just below the anxiety. It took 2 hours to get all 18 birds underground. When the last one was through the canvas flap, Ruth latched the outer door, descended the ramp, and sat down on the straw-covered floor with her back against the south wall. 18 hens surrounded her in various states of adjustment, some pecking at the straw with the quick, mechanical attention of birds that have found their footing, some standing very still with that sideways head look that meant the decision was still being made. She sat with them. One by one over the course of an hour they made their decisions. They found the water dish in the north corner. They discovered the feeds scattered near the roost perches. They investigated the nesting boxes with the thorough, unhurried attention of animals assessing new real estate. The large Rhode Island red that Ruth had always considered the most practical-minded of her flock walked once around the entire perimeter of the chamber, paused in the column of light from the skylight, turned slowly as if taking a measurement, and then walked to the nearest roost perch and stepped up onto it with the air of an animal that has completed its due diligence and reached a satisfactory conclusion. By the time Ruth climbed out through the vestibule, the chamber had the sound of a normal flock on a normal afternoon. Not the strained, anxious quiet of frightened animals, but the low, continuous domestic commentary of birds going about their business. She sealed the outer door carefully. Outside, the sky had gone from white to the dark specific charcoal that preceded serious snow. The temperature was dropping fast. She could feel it in the air, the quality of the cold changing from the dry cold of clear weather to the wet, heavy cold that carried snow. Ruth walked back to the sod house, split enough wood to see her through 3 days of full fire, carried it inside in 2 loads, and built the fire up to a high burn before banking it for the night. Then she sat at the kitchen table and did what she had not allowed herself to do since she had first driven the spade into the ground 3 weeks ago. She waited. 7 days. She gave herself 7 days before expecting anything from the hens. They needed time for their bodies to register the new environment, to count the hours of light through the skylight, to process the information and respond. 7 days was what the logic of it required. She went down every morning before full light. She refilled the water-scattered feed, noted the temperature reading on the thermometer, observed the birds. They settled faster than she had expected by the 3rd day. They were moving through the chamber with the unhurried confidence of hens that have decided a place is theirs, the initial anxiety entirely gone. 4 days, no eggs. 5 days, no eggs. 6 days, no eggs. Ruth noted the absence each morning without allowing herself to panic, because panic was not useful information, and she had made a commitment to useful information. The hens were healthy, the temperature was stable. The light was reaching them for approximately 7 hours through the angled skylight, which in November was close to what they had been receiving in September, the last month they had laid reliably. Either it would work or it would not. She had done everything she knew how to do. On the morning of the 8th day, she descended the ramp in the dark before dawn, pushed through the canvas flap, and stood in the chamber, while her eyes adjusted to the deeper dark inside. She went to the nesting boxes on the east wall and put her hand into the first one. An egg. Still warm from the body of the hen that had left it there, smooth and solid and real in her palm, in a way that felt almost surprising, not because she hadn't expected it, but because the hours of not expecting it had accumulated into something she hadn't quite shaken. She checked the second box. An egg. The third box. Two eggs close together from two hens who apparently shared a preference for the same nesting box. The fourth box. One egg slightly smaller than the others from one of the younger hens who had never quite reached full laying size. 6 eggs. In the middle of November, in the beginning of what was already shaping up to be the hardest winter Kansas had experienced in a generation, with a temperature outside the chamber that was somewhere below 15 degrees, and the snow that had started on the 3rd of the month still on the ground, and more coming, 6 eggs still warm in her hands. Ruth did not go back up the ramp. She sat down on the straw-covered floor of the chamber, her back against the south wall, her legs extended in front of her on the straw. She held the 6 eggs in her lap. The Rhode Island red walked across her right boot and kept going without acknowledgement. The column of light from the skylight was not yet illuminated. Dawn had not arrived above ground yet, but she could feel the warmth. The earth held the steady 52 degrees that did not know and did not care what the thermometer outside was doing. She sat there for a long time. She was not comfortable. The packed earth floor was cold even through the straw, and her back ached from 3 weeks of digging, and she was 63 years old and alone on 40 acres of frozen Kansas prairie, with a dead husband and a burnt under the floorboards in a winter ahead of her that she still had no guarantees about. But she sat with 6 warm eggs in her lap and allowed herself for the first time since October to believe that she was going to be all right. Not prosperous, not safe in any large sense of the word, but all right, still here, still producing something from this ground that was hers and Harold's, and now, by necessity and by choice, and by 3 weeks of digging, hers alone. She sat until the cold in the earth floor worked its way up through the straw into her bones. Then she stood up, counted the eggs one more time, placed them with great care in the deep pockets of her coat, and climbed back out into the snow. The snow had arrived on the 3rd of November and had not left. It came first as the kind of snow that seemed polite light, dry, the flakes small and separate, drifting down through still air and settling on the frozen grass without urgency. Ruth had watched it from the kitchen window while she drank her morning coffee and noted it the way she noted most things at that point, as information, not as threat. Snow in early November was expected. Snow in early November was simply winter announcing itself the way it always did, with a quietness that did not fully indicate what it intended. By the second week of November, she understood what this winter intended. The temperature dropped below zero on the 14th and did not come back up. The snow that followed was nothing like the early November snow. It came sideways, driven by a northwest wind that found every gap in the sod walls and every weakness in the doorframe and every place where the caulking had cracked during the summer heat. It turned the 40 acres into a single featureless, white plain with no visible horizon, no landmarks, no suggestion that anything existed beyond it. Ruth had lived through hard winters in Ohio. She had lived through 2 Kansas winters already, the second of which had been genuinely severe. She understood cold in the practical, intimate way that people understand things they have survived personally. This was different. This was the kind of cold that did not feel like weather. It felt like a decision. She kept the fire burning through the night now, waking twice to add wood and check the thermometer inside the sod house. Harold had said 4 cords would see them through an average winter. She was beginning to understand with a certainty that grew each morning when she read the thermometer on the outside wall that this was not going to be an average winter. She rationed the wood with the same careful arithmetic. She applied to everything enough warmth to be functional, not enough to be comfortable, the middle ground, where you could keep working and keep thinking. The chickens were fine. This was the fact she returned to every morning, the fact that organized everything else around it. For a first light, before coffee, before anything, she went down the ramp, through the vestibule, through the canvas flap, and stood in the 52-degree chamber while the hens moved around her feet with their customary indifference to drama. She checked the thermometer. She counted eggs. She refilled the water, breaking the thin skin of ice that formed overnight on the surface of the dish, despite the warmth of the chamber, and she scattered fresh feed and checked each nesting box and climbed back out into whatever the morning had decided to be. 6 eggs most days, sometimes 7. Once in late November, on one of the rare days when the clouds broke and the sun came out at the angle that hit the skylight directly, 8 eggs, the same number she had been getting in September, when the laying had felt ordinary, effortless, the expected condition of a well-kept flock. 8 eggs in November. She stood in the chamber on that morning and looked at them arranged in the nesting boxes with the same careful attention she brought to everything, and she felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled since the morning she had driven the first shovel into the ground. 15 cents a dozen. She rode into town the second week of November with 2 dozen eggs packed in straw in a wooden box the first time she had made the trip since Harold's funeral. The roads were passable, barely the frozen ground, solid enough under the wagon wheels, the worst of the drifts not yet high enough to block passage. She sold both dozen to the boarding house, which was running low on eggs and would take everything she could bring, and 1 additional dozen to the Reverend's wife who came to the door when she heard the wagon and looked at the box of eggs, the way people look at something they had stopped expecting to exist. "Where did you get these?" she asked. "My hens," Ruth said. The Reverend's wife looked at her steadily. "Your hens are still laying." "They are." A silence. "Mine stopped the first week of November. Everyone I've spoken to, their birds stopped by the 12th at the latest. Emmett Crane was at the store yesterday saying his wife's last egg came on the 22nd of October. Ruth said nothing to this. She accepted the coins Mrs. Marsh counted out, placed them in her coat pocket, and drove home across the frozen prairie under a sky that was considering more snow. That evening, she moved the coins from her coat pocket to the jar under the floorboards, added them to what was already there, and held the jar for a moment before setting it back in its place. The jar was not full. It was not close to full. But it was growing when every other jar in the county was going in the opposite direction, and in November, that was the direction that mattered. She went to bed that night feeling something she had not felt since October. Not happiness, not exactly. Not the uncomplicated relief of a problem solved. Something more durable than either of those, the particular steadiness of a person who has built something, tested it under real conditions, and found that it holds. Dorothea Crane sent Emmett on the last Friday of November. Ruth heard the horse before she saw the rider, that specific rhythm of a single horse moving across frozen ground, a sound that carried clearly in the still cold. She came out to meet him at the fence because standing in doorways in that temperature was impractical. Emmett Crane pulled his horse up at the fence line, looked at the property for a moment with the measuring attention he had brought to it before, and tipped his hat. "Dorothea wants to know if you have eggs to sell," he said with the directness of a man relaying a message he has been given word for word. Ruth looked at him without speaking for a moment. "She says her birds gave out completely on the 22nd, he continued. "She's been asking around. There's nothing to be found in town." "I have eggs," Ruth said. "How many does she need?" 2 dozen to start. If the quality is good, she'll want more on a weekly basis. The quality is the same as it's always been. 15 cents a dozen. Emmett nodded, dismounted, and waited at the fence while Ruth went inside, packed 2 dozen eggs carefully in straw in a wooden box, and brought them back out. He took the box and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked past Ruth at the rise behind the house, the small hill with its nearly invisible skylight, the pale rectangle of glass catching the flat winter light at the angle she had calculated over 2 evenings at the kitchen table. "It's working," he said, not a question. "It's working," Ruth confirmed. He was quiet for a moment with the expression of a man deciding whether to say something. "She won't come herself," he said at last. "You understand that?" "I understand it perfectly," Ruth said. Something moved across Emmett's face, an expression that occupied the territory between apology and respect, without quite being either. He counted out 30 cents with deliberate care and placed the coins on the top fence post, rather than handing them directly, which was the particular grammar of this transaction and its history. He climbed back onto his horse. "I'll tell her the quality was good," he said. "You do that," Ruth said. She watched him ride back toward town until the white expanse absorbed him. Then she picked up the coins from the fence post, held them for a moment, and went inside. The following Wednesday, Emmett came back alone. He tied his horse at the fence and stood with his hat in his hands for a moment before speaking, and there was something in his posture, a deliberateness, a preparation that told Ruth this visit was different from the last one. "I'd like to see it," he said, "if you are willing to show me." Ruth looked at him for a moment. He was not asking for himself only. She understood he was asking as the person who would carry the knowledge outward, who would translate what he saw into language that other people in the county could understand and use. He was asking without saying so to be shown something worth knowing. "Come on then," she said. She led him around the back of the sod house, To the rise opened the outer wooden door, held the canvas flap aside. Emmett Crane descended the ramp and stood in the chamber. He stood there for a long time without speaking. The temperature was 52 degrees. He could feel it immediately, a warmth that was not dramatic, but was unmistakable after the bitter air outside. 18 hens moved around his boots with the unhurried confidence of animals in a space they have claimed. The column of pale light from the angled skylight reached the straw floor and spread there in a quiet, steady oval. It smelled like earth and warmth, and the living smell of animals that were content, the same smell as a well-kept barn in September, transplanted underground into the worst week of November. He looked at the thermometer on the east wall, 52 degrees. He looked at the skylight above the pale rectangle of winter light coming through the cracked glass at its calculated angle. He looked at the 4 nesting boxes on the east wall. 3 of them held eggs from the morning collection. He stood there and took it all in with the systematic attention of a man who is memorizing something he intends to reconstruct. "You built this alone," he said. It was not a question this time, but it carried a weight that the earlier version of the same statement had not. The earlier version had been surprise. This was something closer to accounting, a man summing up the magnitude of what he was standing inside. "I did," Ruth said. He was quiet for another moment. Then, with a simplicity that contained more than it said, "I'm going to tell people about this." "Tell whoever you like," Ruth said. "The principle isn't complicated. Anyone can build one." He bought 4 dozen eggs that day, paying without negotiation, and rode back toward town with the careful steadiness of a man carrying something he intends to deliver intact. December brought temperatures that Ruth had no frame of reference for. The thermometer outside the kitchen window read 22 below zero on the 3rd morning of January, and she read the number twice because she did not entirely trust her eyes in the cold. 22 below. She had never seen that number on a thermometer in her life. It belonged in the kind of newspaper account that described somewhere else, somewhere that had built its entire existence around the management of such cold, not here on the Kansas plain, where the sod houses sat with their thin walls and their banked fires and their optimistic faith in human endurance. The world in significant ways stopped. Livestock died on farms that had not brought their animals inside early enough. The Henderson family lost 4 cattle in a single night, found them in the morning, standing frozen in the north pasture in exactly the positions they had been standing when the temperature dropped past the point that their bodies could manage, as though they had simply paused and the cold had agreed. The road to town was buried under drifts for 11 consecutive days in January, drifts that reached the eaves of the Crane General Store and had to be excavated by hand before commerce could resume. Ruth did not go to town for those 11 days. She did not need to. She had her provisions, her fire, her carefully rationed wood. She had 6 to 7 eggs per day coming up from the chamber under the rise warm from the hens that produced them, unaffected by the catastrophe occurring 40 feet above their heads. She ate well. She kept warm enough to function. She read from Harold's books. In the evenings, he had brought 11 of them from Ohio, carefully chosen after long consideration, and she had worked through 4 of them already and was into the 5th, a natural history of North American birds, that she found unexpectedly engaging, given the particular nature of her current circumstances. She thought about Harold in the evenings, in the hour after the fire was stoked, and before she was tired enough to sleep. Not with the consuming, disorienting grief she had seen break other widows, the kind that made the ordinary world feel uninhabitable. She thought about him the way you think about someone who is in the next room, aware of his presence, oriented by it, sustained by the knowledge of him, without requiring the physical fact. She talked to him in the evenings. Not the frantic talking of a lonely person filling silence with noise. The measured, even conversation of someone who has something to report, in a habit of reporting it to a specific person. "It's $22 now," she said one evening in late January, to the empty chair and the firelight, and the quality of silence that had shifted over the months from absence to something more like companionable quiet. $22 in the car, and I haven't touched the provisions fund. I think by March I'll have enough for the plow. Maybe the team as well if the egg prices hold where they are." She paused. "They went to 50 cents a dozen this week," she said. "There's nothing else to be found in the county. Mrs. Marsh sent her husband twice in the last 2 weeks. Even the boarding house sent someone, at 50 cents a dozen." She looked at the fire. "You would have found that very satisfying, Harold. You always liked a price discovery." She paused again. You knew I would figure it out, she said. Her voice was steady. You always knew that before I did. The eggs had become something people talked about. In a county where every flock had gone silent in November, where the boarding house was paying whatever was asked for any eggs that could be found, where the Reverend's wife had taken to including an inquiry about Ruth's health in every conversation in a way that had everything to do with supply chain and only a little to do with genuine concern in this county. In this winter, the fact that Ruth Holt's hens were laying had become the kind of information that traveled through a community, the way important practical information always travels not through formal announcement, but through the specific conversations that happen when people are in the same place waiting for the same scarce thing. Emmett Crane had told 3 people about the underground coop. Those 3 had told others. By February, Ruth had 6 regular customers besides the Crane household, and she had raised her price in stages 20 cents in December when the general shortage became apparent, 30 cents in January when the shortage became severe, 50 cents in the first week of February when eggs were genuinely rare in a way that had nothing to do with market manipulation and everything to do with physics. She did not apologize for the price. The price was what it was because the supply was what it was, and she had built the supply at considerable personal cost. And anyone who could perform basic arithmetic understood that 50 cents a dozen in February of 1887 was not extortion, but the simple outcome of the difference between a woman who had solved a problem and a county that had not. Dorothea continued to send Emmett every Friday. He came at the same time each week, reliable as tide, and bought 2 dozen eggs at whatever price Ruth was charging without any attempt at negotiation. He paid from a small leather purse that Ruth had begun to suspect Dorothea specifically filled for this purpose before each visit, and he never commented on the price regardless of where it had moved since the previous Friday. And there was in his weekly visits a quality of penance that Ruth found neither satisfying nor unsatisfying, simply accurate, a correct accounting of the distance between where things had been and where they were. Then came the Friday in the second week of February when Emmett did not come. Ruth set aside the 2 dozen she had prepared and thought nothing of it. Roads were difficult. Temperatures had dropped again. There were 100 legitimate reasons a man might not make a 4-mile round trip in February of that winter. She put the eggs back and expected him Saturday or Monday. On Saturday morning, she heard a wagon. She came out to find Dorothea Crane sitting in the driver's seat alone. Her broad shoulders rounded slightly against the cold in a way that somehow made her look both smaller and more human than she usually did. Emmett was sick, a chest cold Ruth learned later that had kept him inside for a week and had apparently been judged insufficient justification for missing the weekly egg purchase. Ruth waited at the fence while Dorothea climbed down from the wagon. It was a careful descent, the descent of a woman managing both her aging body and the additional weight of this particular errand simultaneously. They stood facing each other across the fence line. Dorothea looked at the property, the sod house, the rise with its skylight, the pale glass barely visible from this angle, the bare winter acres stretching out in every direction. She looked at Ruth, at her face and her posture, and the particular quality of her stillness, which was the stillness of someone who has nothing to explain and is not going to attempt to explain it. 2 dozen, Dorothea said. Same as usual. 50 cents a dozen, Ruth said. Same as last week. Dorothea opened her purse, counted out $1 in coins, and extended them across the fence. Ruth opened the gate, took the money, went inside, came back with 2 dozen eggs packed in fresh straw, and handed the box across. The silence between them had the quality of a conversation that had already been completed. Not a silence waiting to be filled, but a silence that was itself the content that said everything the situation required without needing to say it out loud. Dorothea looked down at the box of eggs. How, she said, and stopped. She started again with the careful precision of a woman choosing her words in real time. How did you know it would work? Ruth thought about this for a moment, genuinely thought about it, not performing consideration, but actually reviewing the honest answer. I didn't, she said. I knew I needed it to work. That's different. Dorothea looked up from the eggs. Something in her face changed, not the dramatic visible change of revelation, not the large emotional movement that stories tend to assign to these moments, but a subtle rearrangement, the particular shift of a face that has received information, It is incorporating against some internal resistance, incorporating it anyway because the information is demonstrably true. She said nothing more. She walked back to the wagon with the careful movements she had come with, set the eggs on the seat beside her, with as much care as Ruth had used in packing, then climbed up and drove away. Ruth watched her go. She felt nothing theatrical about it. No triumph, no vindication, none of the satisfactions that the situation might have been expected to generate. What she felt was something quieter and more solid. She felt correct. She had been correct about the land, correct about the eggs, correct about the winter, correct about herself. A correctness sustained over time was its own sufficient reward. She went back inside and added $1 to the jar. Lavinia Pruitt came in March when the worst had passed. The roads had been passable for a week by the time she drove in from the north, the same cart and the same mule moving at the same philosophical pace, as though the entire winter had been a minor inconvenience in a long life of managed inconvenience. The snow was retreating from the south-facing slopes, lingering in the hollows and the north sides of hills, and the sky had taken on the tentative provisional quality of a sky that is considering a change of season without yet committing to it. Lavinia walked the property before coming inside. She looked at the underground entrance, the wooden doors set into the south side of the rise, weathered now from the winter, the frame tight and sound. She looked at the skylight on top of the rise, the cracked glass in its wooden frame, still seated, still sealed, still doing exactly what it had been placed there to do. She looked at Ruth herself, at her face, in the set of her shoulders, in the condition of her hands, the particular composite that tells anyone who knows how to read it whether a person has come through something or merely endured it. She looked at the jar Ruth had set on the kitchen table. "How much?" she asked. "Enough for a plow," Ruth said, "and a team. Spring seed with enough left for contingencies I haven't thought of yet." Lavinia picked up the jar, held its weight for a moment, set it back down. "My mother-in-law would have liked you," she said. "She always said the best farmers think with the land instead of against it." Ruth considered this. "I had a place to start," she said. "You gave it to me. One sentence." "I told you a thing I remembered," Lavinia said with the precision of someone for whom the distinction mattered. "You figured out how to do it. Those are not the same thing." She stayed for coffee, talked about the families that had gone back east and the ones that had stayed and what the winter had cost each kind of family in different ways. She was 77 years old, and the drive back was 4 miles, and the afternoon went quickly in early March. At the fence, she paused. "What will you do with the coop in summer?" she asked. "Keep the hens in it," Ruth said. "It runs cooler than a surface coop in July. They'll lay better in the heat." Lavinia looked at her with the expression of someone who has just confirmed a final piece of something they were already largely sure of. "Year-round production," she said. "That's the idea." The old woman nodded once the specific nod of someone making a permanent entry in a private ledger climbed into her cart and drove north without looking back. Spring came slowly to Kansas that year, the way it always came after a hard winter, reluctantly, as though the cold had used up not just the season's warmth but its willingness to return. The snow melted in stages, south-facing slopes, first hollows, last, and the ground took weeks to give up its frost. And the roads went from frozen to impassable mud and back to frozen twice before they finally settled into something that could be trusted. In the first week of April, Ruth moved the winter's remaining provisions out of the root cellar to make room for the seed she was planning to buy. Harold's things were still in the corner where she had placed them in October. His good coat, his extra pair of boots, the canvas bag he had carried from Pennsylvania to Ohio, and from Ohio to Kansas. She picked up the coat to fold it and store it properly. Something was in the inside pocket. She put her hand in and found a piece of paper folded multiple times and worn at the folds from being opened and refolded, the paper itself softened to the texture of cloth at the creases. She unfolded it carefully. It was a page torn from an agricultural newspaper. The masthead said Pennsylvania Farmer, and the date at the top was March of 1882, 4 years ago, a full year before they had left Ohio for Kansas. The headline read, "Root Cellars and Winter Poultry Keeping Hens Through Frost." Ruth read it standing in the root cellar in the April cold. The article described in the plain and practical language of a farming journal exactly what she had built, the recommended depth, the importance of temperature stability below the frost line, the critical role of light in maintaining laying through the winter months, the skylight and its angle. even the double-door vestibule to prevent heat loss during entry and exit. All of it, Harold had known. He had carried this page for 4 years across the years of planning and the wagon journey and 3 Kansas winters folded in the inside pocket of his good coat. He had never mentioned it. Not when she had been laying in the eggs and worrying about the winterer. Not when Dorothea had made her prediction about the chickens stopping. Not in the 9 days of his illness when she had sat beside him and told him the ordinary things she had never quite managed to say. He had never needed to mention it. He had known with the quiet, steadfast confidence that had characterized everything Harold did, that if the moment ever came when the information was necessary, she would find it. Ruth stood in the root cellar for a long time. She thought about Harold reading this article in the spring of 1882, folding it carefully, putting it in his coat pocket. She thought about him keeping it there through the years of planning and preparation and the long wagon ride west. She thought about the 9 days of his illness, and the last night she had sat beside him, telling him about the morning light through the south window, and the way the Kansas sky looked in August, and about him lying there listening, and about everything he had known about her that he had never needed to say out loud. She folded the page along Harold's folds, the same crease lines, following the geometry of his hands. She put it in the pocket of her own coat where she could feel it. Then she went outside and began measuring the field for spring planting. The plow came in April, purchased from a man named Gideon Aldrich, who was selling his equipment and his claim, and going back to Indiana with the expression of a man who has made a decision he knows is correct and is not going to let anyone talk him out of it. Ruth paid in cash, counted the coins and bills onto his kitchen table while he watched, and his face went through several stages of expression before settling into something that was not quite envy and not quite respect, but lived in the country between them. The mules came the same week, a matched pair from a widow in the next county who was reducing her operation rather than abandoning it. Practical animals, brown and steady-tempered, the kind of mules that had absorbed the lesson that steady work was more sustainable than dramatic effort. Ruth brought them home on a Thursday afternoon and put them in the barn and stood looking at them in the fading light with the particular feeling of a person who has arrived at a stage they were not certain they would reach. The 40 acres began in the way that first-season fields always begin, reluctantly, with effort pushing back against the plow in ways that required patience and repetition to become what she and Harold had always intended them to become. She kept the chickens underground through the summer. The chamber held at 55 degrees through July and August, 10 to 15 degrees cooler than the surface coop would have been in the Kansas summer heat, which meant the hens were comfortable in July the same way they were comfortable in November, the same steady temperature that their bodies registered as productive rather than survival. They laid consistently through the hottest months when every other flock in the county slowed or stopped in the heat, and eggs became for a few weeks in late July almost as scarce as they had been in January. Ruth sold eggs in July for 35 cents a dozen. People stopped being surprised by this and started treating it as simply true, the way reliable things become facts by being true long enough that the questioning stops. Ruth Holt's hens laid year-round. This was something the county knew the way it knew the names of the creeks and the direction of the prevailing wind. Emmett Crane asked Ruth in the spring if he could bring a neighbor to see the underground coop. Ruth said yes. He asked to bring another. She said yes again. By the following winter, 4 farms in the county had their own underground coops, each one built to the same principle and modified to the particular terrain and materials and judgment of the farmer who built it. By the winter after that, 11 farms. By 1890, the number was large enough that a man from the Agricultural College in Manhattan came out to document the phenomenon for the Extension Bulletin. He interviewed Emmett Crane, who had built a coop of his own in the fall of 1887. He interviewed 2 other farmers who had built after Emmett. He wrote a careful, thorough account of the thermodynamic principles involved, subsoil temperature stability, the photoperiodic regulation of laying cycles, the importance of artificial light extension, written as though these principles had been discovered through some collaborative process of countywide agricultural inquiry. He did not interview Ruth. Emmett brought her a copy of the bulletin in the spring of 1890. Ruth read it at the kitchen table with the particular quality of attention she brought to things that required correction. She put it in the drawer beside Harold's Bible and did not discuss it further. The Cranes sold a general store in the spring of 1889 and moved to Denver. Dorothea's stated reason was her health. Denver's climate was milder. The altitude suited her. This was the story she gave to everyone who asked consistently and without variation, which was itself a kind of evidence about how much she wanted it to be accepted. The actual reason was understood in the county without being stated in the way that small communities understand what they know without requiring the evidence to be formalized. Dorothea Crane could not continue to live in a county where a 63-year-old widow had proven her wrong in a way that was now literally part of the physical landscape visible to anyone who knew what the small hill with the glass eye in its surface represented mentioned whenever the subject of winter eggs came up, which was often. Ruth heard about the sale on a Tuesday. She thought about it for the length of time it took to drink her morning coffee. Then she put on her coat and went to find Emmett. She found him in the back of the store taking inventory with the methodical unhappiness of a man who is closing something he would have preferred to keep open. He looked up when she came in, and his expression had the transparency of a man who was too tired for its usual discretion. "I'd like to make an offer on the building," Ruth said. He looked at her for a moment. "The whole property," he said. "The store and the lot. I have cash." He named a price. It was not a low price, but it was fair, and fair was the only standard Ruth had ever held to. She counted the money onto the same counter where she had been buying supplies for 3 years, the counter where Dorothea had once recommended she find a room at the boarding house and leave the land to someone younger. The irony existed. Ruth did not make anything of it. She took possession of the store in June of 1889. She renamed it Holt General Store, Harold's name, the name she had come west with, the name under which the 40 acres had been purchased and the underground coop had been built, and the winter of 1886 had been survived. She operated it for 12 years, selling provisions and seed and hardware and eggs to the homesteaders, who kept arriving, the ones who needed everything and whose eyes went to the person behind the counter and registered something, competence perhaps, or the specific quality of a person who has been tested and knows it, that made them trust what she told them. She kept a second underground coop behind the store, built the same way as the first 8 hens, producing year-round. She sold eggs across the counter at prices slightly below what anyone else was charging, and still turned a profit because her cost of production after 3 years of refinement was lower than anyone else's, and she had learned from Harold that a sustainable margin was better than a dramatic one. She married again in 1891. His name was Caleb Ferris. He had come west from Virginia with a quiet temperament, a reliable eye for weather, and a complete absence of any desire to be more prominent than the situation required, which suited Ruth entirely. He had been married before his first wife had died in 1878, leaving him with 2 daughters who were grown by the time he arrived in Kansas. They ran the store together. They worked the 40 acres together in the planting seasons. It was not a romantic story in any conventional sense. It was a practical story, the story of 2 people who recognized in each other a compatible approach to the business of living and who found over the years that practical compatibility had its own warmth. In the autumn of 1891, Lavinia Pruitt died. She went quietly in her own house, in her own bed, which was what she would have wanted. Ruth drove out for the funeral on a cold October morning that had in its quality of light and temperature something of the same character as the October morning 5 years earlier, when she had stood beside Harold's grave with dirt still on her hands. She stood beside Lavinia's grave while the Reverend read, and she thought about what the old woman had done. The single sentence delivered without fanfare on a November afternoon. The one piece of information offered once and then left entirely alone, not followed up, not explained further, not claimed as advice or instruction or the beginning of any ongoing guidance. Just here is a thing that exists in the world. What you do with it is your business. Ruth paid for a stone that winter. It seemed correct that she should be the one to do it. The stone read Lavinia Pruitt, 1809-1891. She knew where the light needed to go. The original underground coop stood until 1923, when Ruth's step-grandson Thomas, the son of Caleb's elder daughter, a practical young man in his early 30s, who had taken over the farm after Caleb's death in 1912, decided to fill it in. The wooden door frame had rotted through the glass, and the skylight was cracked entirely now and held in place only by habit and the remaining pressure of the frame. It had become a hazard for the children who played on the rise, and hazards on working farms were not left unaddressed. Thomas filled it in on a Saturday in September with 2 neighbors helping, and Ruth, 83 years old, in the chair they had carried outside so she could watch, observe the process without visible emotion. When the last of the earth went in and the rise was level for the first time in 37 years, Thomas came and sat beside her. He was a practical young man, but he was also young enough to worry about the feelings of old women, and this seemed like the kind of moment that required acknowledgement. "Does it bother you?" he asked. Ruth looked at the smooth ground where the door had been. "No," she said. "The idea doesn't need the hole." By 1923, there were more than 40 underground coops across the county. Some of them were third-generation structures built by farmers whose parents had built the second generation, who had heard about the first generation from Emmett Crane or from someone who had heard from Emmett Crane. Some of the farmers who maintained these coops had no idea who had built the first one. The agricultural college had given the method a formal name now, and there were papers written about it, and the papers cited each other, and none of them traced the lineage back to a 63-year-old widow on a 40-acre claim who had dug 8 feet down into the Kansas clay with swollen hands in the October of 1886 because it was either that or give up, and she had not been prepared to give up. Ruth had her own name for the method. She called it thinking with the land instead of against it. She had borrowed the phrase from Lavinia, who had gotten it from her mother-in-law, who had carried it from a tradition of practical knowledge passed between women in ways that rarely got written down, because the women passing it along are rarely the ones doing the writing. It got written down eventually. There is a photograph of Ruth Holt Ferris taken in 1905 standing in front of the store she had owned for 16 years. She is 82 years old, I assume. Her hair is entirely white pinned back with the no-nonsense severity of a woman who stopped making concessions to appearance when appearance began costing time she had other uses for. Her face carries the specific geography of a life lived mostly outdoors, the lines around the eyes, from decades of squinting at Kansas horizons, the set of the jaw that belongs to someone who has known her own mind for long enough that it has become structural. She is smiling. Not the careful, managed smile of a woman performing pleasantness for a camera. A full smile, the kind that reaches the eyes, the kind that belongs to someone who knows exactly what she has accomplished and has arrived at the point in life where she no longer needs anyone else to confirm it. The caption reads, Ruth Holt Ferris, proprietor, Holt General Store, Cimarron, Kansas. It does not mention the eggs. It does not mention the underground coop or the winter of 1886 or the cracked pane of glass carried 2 miles wrapped inside a coat or the 52 degrees that held through the worst winter Kansas had seen in a generation, or the 6 warm eggs in the dark on the morning of the 8th day, or the jort under the floorboards, or the dollar counted onto the fence post each Friday, or the single sentence from an old woman in October that started everything, or the folded newspaper page in the inside pocket of a dead man's coat that confirmed what a living woman had already figured out on her own. It does not need to. The people who were there remembered. They told their children told theirs. And somewhere below the smooth Kansas ground in the dark and the warmth and the quiet that exists beneath the frost line, where the temperature holds at 52 degrees regardless of what the surface decides to do, where the ancient steadiness of deep earth persists through every winter, that the sky sends down, idea persists with it, unchanged, still producing.